I'd like to welcome everybody to our presentation today for our Property and Dispossession speaker series. Before I begin, I'd like to begin obviously with our Territorial Acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, as many of you who have been coming to our presentations know, what we've been looking at is have been the works of recent scholars who have approached the question of dispossession and its relationship to property in differing ways, different methodological approaches. And with that in mind, today's presentation by Dr. Susan Marks promises to be absolutely wonderful. For those of you who don't know, our presenter, Susan Marks, is Professor of International Law at the London School of Economics, previously having taught at both the University of Cambridge and King's College London. She is the author of a number of books, including The Riddle of All Constitutions, the International Human Rights Lexicon, which is co-authored, and what we'll be hearing about today, A False Tree of Liberty, and has also edited International Law on the Left. Susan is coming to us not from the LSE at the moment, but is phoning in from Berlin, so which means that she's up a little later than we are at the moment. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Susan to talk to us all today about the question of false tree of liberty. I'll hand over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's great to be here virtually. I was thinking it would have been wonderful to be there physically. I've never actually visited that part of Canada and would love to do so perhaps one day. I'm very grateful then for this invitation to speak about a book that came out now a couple of years ago. It's about how the history of human rights relates to the history of property rights. The book tries to shed light on that question, and it does so by bringing into focus one key episode in the history of the idea of human rights, and then by situating that episode within a longer tradition of activism and thought about property, humanity, and rights. Let me share my screen with you, if I may. Just at this moment, I've just got a few slides to complement my presentation. Okay, can you see that? Good. So the episode in question is the debate about the rights of man in England, which was sparked by the French Revolution and the declaration in that context of a catalogue of rights of man and the citizen. This debate is, of course, mostly associated with the two figures of Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. Burke, the great skeptic, who in his Reflections on the Revolution in France of 1790 denounced the rights of man as a monstrous fiction spreading across the Channel, and Paine, the great advocate, who penned his Rights of Man in two parts that appeared in 1791 and 1792 to answer Burke's attack and make the case for the rights of man, understood principally as the rights that pertain to popular self-government. But there was a third, less famous protagonist who also had a significant position in this debate and deserves to be better known, or so I argue in my book. Someone who went along neither with Burke in his denunciation of the rights of man, nor with Paine in his advocacy for the rights of man. I noticed there's a message in the chat. I better just, okay, so it's just, okay, fine. It's just to say that all is well. So the name of this third protagonist that I'm wanting to discuss a bit more today and that I spend time on in this book is Thomas Spence. This is perhaps what he looked like. And while Spence had a certain following in his own time, he was also, perhaps for that very reason, belittled and disparaged. And I think it's fair to say that he's not been taken seriously by historians until relatively recent times and is not very well known today. Spence was born in 1759 to poor Scottish parents who lived at the time in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England, and he died in London in 1814. An autodidact with radical leanings, Spence worked initially as a school teacher, and one of his early projects was to devise a new alphabet and system of spelling for the English language. He called it the Grand Repository of the English Language. In part, this was because he wanted to make it easier and quicker for people to learn to read. But in part also, it was because he realized that social inequality in Britain had, and of course still has, a strong linguistic dimension. The way people speak marks them, not only regionally, but also in terms of class. So his idea was to reform the written language so that it would clearly single the received pronunciation, thus enabling people like himself with non-standard accents to speak, as it was said, correctly and not get stigmatized. Shows you that work and something of his new alphabet. At a certain point, Spence moved from Newcastle upon Tyne to London, where he ran a bookstall and then a bookshop, and eventually put out a magazine aimed at ordinary working people, in which he published what he took to be important and edifying texts, including some of his own authorship. He called the text Pig's Meat. And at a certain point, he also put out a text called Hogwash, in ironic reference to the passage in Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, where Burke wrote of the danger that in England, as in France after the revolution, as Burke saw it, now quoting, learning, along with its protectors and guardians, whom Burke took to be the aristocracy and the clergy, will be cast into the mire and trodden down under the hooves of a swinish multitude, wrote Burke. Mocking that contempt for the poor, Spence took on the insult and used it as the name of his elevating magazine. One of Spence's own writings that he put out in Pig's Meat is a short text entitled A Fragment of an Ancient Prophecy. The text was published for Spence in 1796, at a time when, as the imprint, you can vaguely see it on the screen there, tells us that he had a shop at number 8 Little Turnstile on High Holborn in London. That's a significant address for me because High Holborn is just off Lincoln's Inn Fields, where my law department is situated. So why a fragment of an ancient prophecy? What kind of title is that? It's a striking feature of Spence's life and work that he expressed his ideas in a profusion of different forms. He chalked slogans as graffiti on pavements and walls. He created designs and legends for collectible tokens and coins, which he sold. And when it came to his texts, he framed them in a tremendous variety of different ways, not only as essays and letters in the popular idiom of the time, but also as dialogues, as poems, as songs, as dreams. He wrote a utopian constitution, and here, perhaps alluding to the popular millenarianism of his day, a prophetic message. Anyway, this made-up fragment of an ancient prophecy goes in part like this. He wrote, "And during the propagation of the true system, certain philosophers shall arise of great abilities, who shall erect a false tree of liberty, composed of heterogeneous materials, part liberty and part tyranny, capable of shedding the influence of liberty and independence only on the wealthy, the shadow scarcely falling on the poor, who are still to groan under oppression. Nevertheless," he went on, those philosophers shall so far animate the people with the display of their specious but partial rights of man, that the multitude shall arise, and great convulsions shall be in many countries, and kingdoms and principalities and hierarchies and governments shall be overthrown, but oppression shall still remain. Spence believed that the root of oppression was private ownership of land, and he spent his adult life advocating for a proposal that would take land out of private ownership and vest it in local communities, then known as parishes. He called this, often referring to himself in the third person, as Spence's plan. Insofar as the rights of man, as articulated and promoted by Thomas Paine and others, disregarded this, insofar as they left the system of private landowning in place, Spence writes here that the rights of man were specious and partial, composed of heterogeneous materials, part liberty, but also part tyranny. The tree of liberty that Paine and others were planting was therefore false. It would cause the multitude to rise up, and kingdoms and principalities and hierarchies and governments would be overthrown. But because it did not challenge the social systemic, as he saw it, agrarian basis of oppression, oppression would still remain. Did that mean that Spence opposed the rights of man and thought the whole idea was flawed and should be abandoned? No, it did not. Here is what was so interesting to me as someone working on human rights when I came across Spence's writing. He identified his plan for vesting land in communal ownership with what he termed the real rights of man. In another text, he spoke of property in land as everyone's right and republished that text in response to Paine's rights of man under the title, The Real Rights of Man. To him, in his counter-vision, the real rights of man were rights of access to the means of subsistence. He argued that the earth was there to support all human beings, that it was wrong for the rich to monopolize the earth and its produce, and that control over the means of sustaining life rightfully belonged to everyone. Spence made these arguments at a moment when, thanks to the pamphlet war sparked by Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, the rights of man were a topic of unprecedented public interest and debate in England. He may have been amongst the first people in that country to challenge in this way narrower conceptualizations of the rights of man, like that being put forward at the time by Paine and others, in which, as I recalled earlier, the focus was on political rights to do with popular self-government, basically universal manhood suffrage. But was Spence the first person in England to claim that the earth was there to support all human beings and that it was wrong for the rich to monopolize it and its produce? Was he the first person in England to say that control over the means of sustaining life was a right that belonged to the whole of humanity? No, he was definitely not. At this point, I need to bring enclosure into the story, because if Spence made these arguments at a moment when the rights of man was a topic of unprecedented public interest and debate in England, he also made these arguments at a moment when the centuries-long process of enclosing common land and extinguishing rights of common was nearing completion. And one of the things I try to do in this book is to show how those things were connected, but also how the kind of argument advanced by Spence carries forward themes of rights and humanity that were already present in the anti-enclosure writing and activism of earlier centuries. As everyone listening in today will know very well, by enclosure is meant here the creation of private property in land, private property that involves exclusive possession. If the idea that ownership involves exclusive possession seems self-evident to people today, we know that that's only because of the success of the ideology of enclosure. Historically, as again, many people here will know, farming in England took place according to a so-called open field system, such that individuals worked strips of land scattered over unfenced fields. Historically, too, villages had a range of use rights or rights of common that allowed them to go onto those fields after the harvest and also to have access to non-arable, so-called wasteland, such as woods and fens. These use rights included rights to glean, that is to say, rights to gather up leftover grain, rights to collect wood and other materials for fuel, rights to graze animals, rights to gather acorns and nuts for animal feed, rights to pick berries and fruits, and rights to cut grasses, reeds and branches to make baskets and brooms, among many other things. Rights of common were not the same everywhere. They were defined by local manorial law and hence varied from locality to locality. But the important thing to notice is that they qualified ownership. The lord of the manor or other landowner held his land subject to them. The significance of enclosure then was that it extinguished rights of common and conferred exclusive ownership on the encloser. To keep animals and people out, enclosers often erected hedges around their land, which became symbols of enclosure, though also they dug ditches or built fences and walls to keep out animals and people and define private land. There is, as many of you will have long known, but as I only discovered when I started doing this research, a vast literature on enclosure in England. And a lot of issues to do with it remain contentious, including when it began, why it began, and what its effects were. In part, that's bound up with the so-called transition debate about feudalism and the origins of capitalism. For present purposes, however, it will be enough to notice that enclosure was well underway by the mid-16th century, and that it was causing very considerable hardship and distress. Ordinary people were losing access to the land on which they relied for all or part of their subsistence, and they did not go quietly into that night. So, for example, in one chapter of the book, I tell the story of Kett's Rebellion. This was a revolt that took place in Norfolk, in the east of England, over 7 weeks in 1549. We know about it because of the work of several rather hostile chroniclers who wrote accounts of it a generation later in the 1570s. What these sources tell us is that on the 6th of July, 1549, a large crowd gathered in the town of Wyndham. It's a town that's pronounced Wymondham, but in the strange way of things in England, it's actually pronounced Wyndham, in Norfolk, not far from Norwich. And the crowd gathered because there was an annual performance that was happening there of a play celebrating the life of Thomas à Becket. Wyndham had an abbey dedicated to Thomas à Becket that had been dissolved 11 years earlier in pursuance of Henry VIII's program of monastery dissolutions. The dissolution of the monastery had caused much grief among the local population, and there was also anger at the corrupt handling of the sale of the abbey's assets by the man who had been charged with overseeing that process, who was a landowner from a neighboring village by the name of John Flowerdew. By tradition, the play in honor of Thomas à Becket and associated festivities ran over 2 days and nights. And it seems that at some point during this time, a group of townspeople formulated a plan to vent their ire on John Flowerdew. Flowerdew had recently enclosed common land, and their plan was to vent their ire on him by throwing down his enclosures, breaking his hedges, and filling in his ditches. On the 9th of July, so a few days after the crowd initially gathered in Wyndham, the group set out for Flowerdew's home, which was in a nearby village called Hethersett. However, when they arrived at Flowerdew's estate in Hethersett, he managed to talk them around. Furthermore, he paid them to head back to Wyndham and break the hedges of another landowner, and who'd also enclosed land from that town, who'd been one of Flowerdew's chief critics in the business over the dissolution of the monastery and of the abbey and the sale of its assets. This was a man by the name of Robert Kett. I have no idea whether that actually looks anything like Robert Kett. It's obviously a detail from a later portrait, a later painting, much later painting. Anyway, the group of townspeople did, and when they got to Kett's estate, an unexpected thing happened. Instead of resisting them, Kett joined the hedge breakers in throwing down his own enclosures, or that's the story, and offered to serve as their leader in a wider effort to reclaim the people's rights of common. As one of the chroniclers puts it, Kett promised to pursue justice for the hurts done to the public weal, the commonwealth, and to the common pasture by the importunate lords thereof. And Kett said that he would, again quoting from this chronicler, do his endeavour that what lands soever he had enclosed should again be made common unto them and to all men, and that his own lands should first perform it. In the days that followed, Kett and his Wyndham companions marched to the nearby city of Norwich, now the county capital of Norfolk, breaking hedges and levelling ditches as they went, needless to say, including Flowerdews at Hethersett. Along the way, they were joined by a growing band of sympathisers. When they came to Norwich, the group destroyed fences on the town close, an area of common pasture that had recently been enclosed, before moving on to Mousehold Heath on the other side of the city. Mousehold Heath, near Norwich, was an historic place resonant of popular rebellion. On the 7th of June, 1381, 2 centuries earlier almost, rebels from Norfolk had held a huge meeting there in the week that preceded an important battle of the Peasants' Revolt of that time. Anyway, once on Mousehold Heath, Kett and those with him set up camp. They were to remain encamped there for the next 6 weeks, during which their numbers continued to swell, reaching, by some accounts, an unprecedented 20,000 people. To defend and govern themselves, they established an army and a decision-making council comprising representatives of the various localities from which the participants came. They also established a court, designating as its site an old oak tree, which they dubbed the Tree or Oak of Reformation. Fairly early on, Ket and other leaders also drew up a document setting out the demands of those assembled on Mousehold Heath for the attention of the King, Edward VI. Their document still survives and is known by the title Ket's Demands, Being in Rebellion. The document comprises 29 paragraphs or articles, which deal with an assortment of grievances, including some that are today quite obscure. But its very first article gets straight to the point. From henceforth, no man shall enclose anymore. 40 people gave their names as subscribers to the text, and there are also signatures appended at the end. It seems that the royal authorities had some sympathy with Ket and his companions' demands, but that the campmen's actions caused great alarm among the local gentry. And a military contingent was eventually sent to disperse the settlement, which it did in a bloody battle that took place on the 7th of August, 1549. Many campmen and women were killed, and Ket, along with a number of others, was captured and hanged, and their mutilated bodies publicly displayed. Apart from the 29 articles of Ket's demands, no writings by those who participated in Ket's rebellions have survived. We only have, as I mentioned, the writings of later chroniclers who were for the most part quite hostile to the rebels, though there is a bit of scope for reading sympathy or at least ambiguity between the lines at some points in their texts, as I discuss in my book. I also mention in the book a work by Robert Crowley. Oh, sorry, I meant to show you this image. That's a scene, again, from a later imagined version of the battle that took place to put down Ket's rebellion. Robert Crowley lived from 1517 to 1588. In 1550, that is to say the year after Ket's rebellion, he wrote a text entitled The Way to Wealth, wherein is plainly taught a most present remedy for sedition. The sedition that he's referring to being Ket's rebellion. Crowley discusses what he takes to be the causes of the unrest that culminated in Ket's rebellion. The text is framed as the alternative analyses of the situation that would be proffered respectively by a poor man from the country and by a wealthy landowner. Crowley proposes that a poor man from the country would say that the causes of the unrest lie with the great farmers, graziers, men of law, gentlemen, and others he could not name. Indeed, now quoting, men that have no name because they are doers in all things that any gain hangeth upon. These doers in all things that any gain hangs upon were, again quoting, men that would have all in their own hands and leave nothing for others, men that would be alone on the earth, men that be never satisfied. Drawing on a popular symbol of audacity and greed, Crowley imagines that the poor man would dub these nameless, shameless profit seekers cormorants, greedy gulls. Yea, he would declare, men that would eat up men, women, and children are the causes of sedition. He would go on. They take our houses over our heads. They buy our grounds out of our hands. They enclose our commons. We know not which way to turn us to live. The poor man would lament that no custom, no law or statute can restrain such men from oppression, and he would conclude that out of necessity, he and his fellows must, quote, stand up against them. Otherwise, he would say, again quoting, we must be their slaves and labor till our hearts burst, and then they must have all.
Because I'm probably going to finish this.
Yeah. Sorry, am I speaking too long? No, okay, sorry.
No, Susan, you're not speaking too long at all. Please.
What then of the great farmers and graziers and others themselves? What would they say? Crowley imagines them exclaiming in horror at the, quote, peasant knaves who would not have us masters of that which is our own. And just as the poor would see the causes of unrest as lying with the profit-seeking rich, so he proposes the rich would see the causes of the unrest, what they would regard as the sedition, as lying with the unruly upstart poor. They would complain that the common people, now quoting, know not themselves, they know no obedience, they regard no laws, they would have all things common. We will teach them to know their betters, the well-off men would retort. And because they would have all common, we will leave them nothing. After rehearsing each side of this argument, Crowley gives his own view. To begin with, he has harsh words for the idea that the poor should stand up against the rich. He believes that the poor should exercise patience and leave God to punish those who, far from oppressing them, should be their protectors and defenders. To his mind, rebellion is the sinful result of greed as much on the poor as on the part of the rich. He is, however, clear that the rich are the origin of the problem. If he depicts them as reacting with comic horror to those who resist their extravagant claims, he also berates them explicitly for, quote, all manner of oppression and extortion. They accuse the poor of disobedience, yet it is they who were, in Crowley's words, first disobedient. Contrary to conscience and law, they, again quoting, enclosed from the poor their due commons, levied greater fines, basically rents, than have heretofore been levied, took them away from their liberties that they held by custom and raised their rents. And even when the king and his commissioners ordered the laying open of their enclosures, they, again quoting, left not off to enclose still, didn't stop enclosing still. Addressing them directly, Crowley warns these, as he calls them, ungentle gentlemen. You shall never the sooner be gentlemen for your stout oppression, nor the later have things in private, for that ye let your tenants live by you upon their labour. The orders for laying open enclosures to which Crowley refers here are a series of statutes and proclamations aimed at arresting the depopulation of villages and towns and curbing the conversion of arable land to pasture, sheep pasture, as was the main rationale for enclosure at the time, as many of you will know. The statutes and proclamations were first enacted during the reign of Henry VII in the late 15th century and reenacted with broader application by subsequent monarchs. Beginning in the 16th century, royal commissions were also appointed to investigate and determine action to be taken with respect to enclosure. Crowley reproaches the ungentle gentlemen, as he calls them, who were engaged in enclosure for arrogantly and unlawfully disregarding both these royal measures and the customary rights of common, which the measures were designed to protect. More fundamentally, however, he condemns what that disregard reflected, a worldview comprising, as he portrays it, three key elements. First, there was the limitless drive to accumulate, the aspiration to have all in one's own hands, and the willingness in pursuit of that aim to do all things that any gain hangs upon. For Crowley, the world is quite obviously to be shared, yet these unnatural men were bent on leaving nothing for others. They wouldn't be satisfied until they were alone on the earth, the sole possessors of land and all its bounty. Second, there was the idea that an owner can do whatever he likes with what he owns. The great farmers and graziers claim to be masters of that which is their own. They hold themselves out as lords of their possessions to use as they shall think good. Yet Crowley tells the rich that God gave men their possessions, and accordingly, men must account to God for their use of them. Rejecting absolute ownership as a smokescreen for irresponsibility and indeed inhumanity, Crowley argues instead for a notion of responsible stewardship. Possessioners should consider themselves to be but stewards and not lords over their possessions, he writes. A third element completed the encloser's worldview. This was the vision, still embryonic and far from fully formed at this time, of a society divided between property owners and others who worked for them. Whilst wage labour had long been used to supplement peasant income, paid work took on new significance for those deprived of access to land. Dispossession of land and rights left those affected with no means of surviving independently, and hence with the need to accept whatever work for whatever pay they were offered. For the first time, poverty became not just a matter of bad harvests, but also of working poverty or unemployment. Crowley's message to the ruling elite is that this is a recipe for class war. The way to wealth, his text, dramatizes the potential for such conflict with its speeches by the presumptive antagonists. On the one side, the wealthy landowner expresses hatred for the poor, and after misattributing to them a wish to have all things in common, vows to leave them nothing. On the other side, the poor man from the country exhorts his fellows to stand up against the expropriators, lest they become the rich men's slaves and have to labor until their hearts burst. The encloser's way to wealth was also, they saw, the way to poverty, and, as Crowley warned, the way to oppression, resistance, and strife. Of course, the story which Crowley tells of the proletarianization of small producers in the English countryside is similar to the one Karl Marx was later to tell in the final chapters of the first volume of Capital. That's not a coincidence, of course, since Marx based his account on mid-16th century material he found in the British Library, including this text by Crowley. 2 centuries before Marx, it's also a story that got taken up in a very different context and in very different terms by the mid-17th century digger leader, Gerard Winstanley. I touch on something of Winstanley's astonishing writings in another chapter of my book. It started, writes the great historian of 17th century England, Christopher Hill, as so much 17th century thinking did, with a vision. Writing in January 1649, Gerard Winstanley tells of how he fell into a trance one day. Strange things appeared in front of his eyes, and a voice spoke to him with these words: "Work together, eat bread together, declare this all abroad." Winstanley refers to the voice variously as that of the spirit and of the law, and he explains that having obeyed its command to declare this message by word of mouth and by my pen, I'll come back to that in a moment, he decided that he needed to go forth and declare it by my action. His moment for doing so arrived a few months later. On the 1st of April 1649, Winstanley and 4 other men gathered on uncultivated common land at St. George's Hill, now part of Weybridge in Surrey, just outside London. Today, St. George's Hill is ranked as one of the most expensive places to live in the United Kingdom, and it's currently the focus of some attention as it's the home of many Russian oligarchs. But in the mid-17th century, the area was open wasteland. Having arrived there, Winstanley and his fellows began digging the ground, hence the name diggers, sowing vegetables and creating makeshift shelters in a collaborative initiative to which everyone was entitled to join. Within a week, the group had grown to 20 or 30, and a small communal settlement was taking shape. Further digger settlements, or digger colonies as they called them, were established at a number of other locations in southern and central England. The movement lasted for a little over a year. The diggers faced persistent harassment by local landowners, both in the courts and through the use of physical violence against individuals and destruction of the crops they planted and the shelters they built. And by May 1650, the last remaining digger colony was dispersed. On the 26th of April 1649, that is to say a month after they began digging the ground at St. George's Hill, Winstanley and 14 other diggers put out a text which they entitled "The True Leveller's Standard Advanced." True Levelers was another name they used for themselves. The text was addressed to the powers of England and to all the powers of the world. Echoing something which Winstanley had already written in another text published under the title "The New Law of Righteousness," the diggers maintained that the earth had been made to be a common treasury for all. Yet it was being converted into a particular treasury for some. Private land ownership was the curse that creation groans under, they wrote, and they expressed their determination to break that curse and remake the earth into a common storehouse for everyone. In another digger text, Robert Coster, one of Winstanley's co-colonists in Surrey, made explicit the diggers' belief that, as he put it, a livelihood is the right of every man. If only the poor could reclaim the means of subsistence, rather than going, to quote him again, with cap in hand and bended knee to gentlemen farmers begging and entreating to work for them for meager pay, end of quote, that right would be secure. Moreover, the gentleman farmers would be deprived of what he termed an occasion to tyrannize over the poor in collaboration with the landlords. And then, he wrote, down would fall the lordliness of their spirits, and then poor people might speak to them. Then there might be an acknowledging of one another to be fellow creatures. In a similar vein, Winstanley's New Law of Righteousness denounced the few unrighteous men who sat high and mighty, as Winstanley put it, in the chair of tyranny, while others were, in his words, trod under the footstool of misery. In doing so, Winstanley also highlighted that tyranny has many faces, which encompass not only the state, but also society. To speak of tyranny was not just to speak of the arbitrary rule of kings, he emphasized, for, again quoting now from Winstanley's New Law of Righteousness, many husbands, parents, masters, magistrates, and others do carry themselves like oppressing lords over such as are under them, not knowing that their wives, children, servants, and subjects are their fellow creatures, and hath an equal privilege to share with them in the blessing of liberty. As scholars have observed, one striking aspect of these digger texts is that their analyses were similarly local and panoramic. These men moved with ease in their writings from the micropolitics of the parish, estate, and family to the level of national policy with respect to land, to the claims that they addressed to all the powers of the world, and the ideas that they put forward in the name of all humanity. For Winstanley, if the earth has been made into a particular treasury for some, that needed to be related to a broader contradiction between social privilege and common humanity. In Costa's formulation, a livelihood was everyone's right. Before human rights became a thing, before the rights of man got to be a concept, here we see examples of how rights and humanity formed part of the idiom in which challenges to private landowning were being pursued. What's the point of remembering all of this? By the second half of the 18th century, Spence's century, royal qualms about enclosure, royal attempts to protect ordinary people against the effects of enclosure were a thing of the very distant past, and a new parliamentary process was introduced to complete the process of so-called land reform that had begun centuries earlier. And here we see the sort of symbol of 18th century parliamentary enclosure, the surveyors. Between 1750 and 1830, almost all of the unenclosed land still remaining in England, 1/5, or by some reckonings closer to a quarter of the country's total land mass, was brought into private ownership. In a related development, landowners commissioned the construction of great houses and huge landscape parks around them, the stately homes that today get used as wedding venues and for weekend outings, to express the wealth they gained through farm enlargement, technological improvement, and the basis for these things, enclosure. That was the background against which Spence put forward his account of the real rights of man, and that is the background against which both he and his precursors, if that is what they are, got relegated for a very long time to the dustiest, dimmest, most hard to reach library shelves. The men of property, as we know, won the day, and these people were either forgotten or depicted as crackpots or cranks, nostalgically holding on to the past, and trying to push back the wheels of social progress. Of course, serious, non-condescending historical work on the diggers, which recognized the transformative and entirely non-nostalgic, non-backward-looking nature of their project, goes back many decades now. Work on Spence, as I said, is rather more recent. Even then, work on Spence tends not to dwell much on his contribution to thinking about human rights. So let me try and wrap up now by saying a few words about how I see that. To provide some context, it may be helpful for me to explain that for some years before writing this book, I'd been writing about how international human rights law is fine and great insofar as it goes, but limited insofar as it fails to grapple with the systemic conditions in which abuses of human rights occur and will presumably recur. We can talk repeatedly and at length about the things that governments and organizations and companies should do to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. But if we really want to bring about change, if we really want to stop abuses, we surely need to confront the question of why those governments and organizations and companies don't do those things. Is that simple inattention, ignorance, or neglect? Or are there countervailing pressures, reasons, forms of rationality, logics to do with the way the world is organized that shape and indeed ratify those actors' omissions and actions? Well, it's of course not an original insight to suggest that there are indeed countervailing pressures and logics. Yet it's not very clear what we're to do with that insight or where we might go with it, at least when it comes to human rights. And it was with that sense of having reached a kind of dead end when it comes to what to do with that insight that I decided to shift from my more familiar theoretical gear to an historical one. And that's when I came across Spence and his fragment of an ancient prophecy, among other texts. Well, it seems to me that there are at least 3 points that we will do well to recover here, and I end with these. The first is the basic notion, which can be found in Spence's work, that the rights of man belong with the effort to elucidate the conditions of oppression and to transform those conditions. In literature about late 18th century England, the word radical is applied to dissidents across a wide spectrum of reformists, from reformists to revolutionaries, but that usage shouldn't be allowed to obscure the fact that Spence was a radical in the precise sense that he took as his goal change from the root upwards. He criticized those whose vision of the rights of man he identified with a false tree of liberty that would cause the multitude to rise up and governments and hierarchies to be overthrown while leaving oppression still to remain. Importantly, however, his response was not to repudiate the rights of man. Rather, in criticizing the failure of pain and others to grapple with the roots of indignity and unfreedom, he advanced his own counter-vision of the real rights of man. Secondly, Spence's counter-vision had as its center the right to subsistence. If his specific claim had to do with property in land, his more general point was that access to and control over the means of sustaining life was everyone's right. In this, he carried forward a tradition of connecting rights, humanity, and subsistence that is coeval with the threat to subsistence posed by the advent, or rather imposition, of market dependence. I go into that a bit in other parts of the book, on which I haven't touched today. Long before people began to declare and debate the rights of man, men and women in the 16th and 17th century in England argued, as I've recalled, that they had the right to a livelihood, that the earth was there to support all human beings, and that it was wrong for the rich to monopolize its produce. Thirdly, and finally, Spence worked with an account of the rights of man in which the rights of man were also the rights of particular people in particular places, and in which the rights of particular people in particular places were also the rights of man. Christopher Hill once wrote that the rights of man are inevitably abstracted from the society in which they are conceived and take the assumptions and property relations of that society for granted. He went on, the state of nature gives the right answers because it's peopled with abstractions. In my book, I suggest that one may speculate with confidence that Spence would have agreed with everything in that passage, except the word inevitably, this idea that the rights of man are inevitably abstracted from the society in which they conceived and take the assumptions and property relations of that society for granted. It was to the experience of expropriation that his real rights of man were addressed. It was the experience of unjust property relations that animated his idea of the state of nature. That experience was irreducibly local and demonstrably diverse, but it also connected those involved and cast in relief the gap between shared humanity and real inequalities. Thank you very much, and sorry to have gone on for so long.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. That was wonderfully elegant presentation. And personally, I have a million questions, and you mentioned at the beginning, wouldn't it have been nice if you could have been here in person? And it would have been so nice because then we could have all gone to lunch and carried on the conversation. But I know that there are people out there with some questions. And so if you could indicate to me by turning on your camera that you wanted to ask a question, I will get you in turn. But Abigail.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. A good way to spend part of a Friday morning. So thanks very much. I have two questions, sort of informational questions. One is about whether there is literature or whether Spence discussed the kind of social relations that are engendered by enclosure. So it seemed in your presentation that a lot of the discussion was about the social and political relations that were engendered because of the threat to taking workers off the land, to the subsistence. But let me rephrase that. Were there discussions of the social relations that are engendered by the commons, not by enclosure? So the kind of social relations, so a lot of the discussion is about the social relations that are engendered by enclosure and how that is very problematic. But I'm interested in who talked about like defending the commons from a political perspective other than just it addresses inequality. And I do have a second question, and that is, Mary Wollstonecraft also just was writing at this time, 1792, the Vindication of the Rights of Women and Vindication of the Rights of Man. And I'm wondering if Spence read her, and I'm wondering if she read Spence, and I don't know if you have any wisdom on that, but I reflect on her Vindication of the Rights of, specifically of women, and think, there's interesting intersections, but some of what you said today leads me to think how conservative some of what she said was, because she did not address any of these concerns about enclosure. But she really was discussing some of the values that and the falseness of the rights of man. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Abigail, those are great questions. By the way, I am conscious that it's rather early for everyone, and I forgot to mention that I want to thank you for convening this session.
Oh, not at all. It's mid-morning for us, so it's all good.
Okay, good. So the social relations associated with the commons, I know why you're posing that question, and that's obviously something that's very interesting to us today. I think for people like Spence, and certainly for the people in earlier periods, it was just, certainly for people in the early periods, it was just normal. I think they regarded sharing as normal, and certainly for people like, you can certainly see it in the earlier people in the 17th century and 16th century people. They just thought self-interest and enclosure was weird. So I'm not sure that they just regard, I mean, and of course, in the case of people like Crowley and Winstanley, they expressed it in religious terms. They thought it was sinful. I think Spence just thought it was he doesn't actually talk, the truth is he doesn't talk much about that. He did think it was important that the land be in common ownership, that the land be not be in private ownership, that there be common access to it and common ownership of it. So it wasn't that he also part of his plan was that rents would be shared. So it wasn't that everyone would work the land, but that rents would be shared as opposed to being monopolized. Wollstonecraft. I talk a bit about Wollstonecraft in my book. I didn't touch on that today. I am not sure whether Spence had read Wollstonecraft. He doesn't refer to her, to my knowledge. Sadly, I don't think Wollstonecraft was as well known in her time as she should have been. The towering figure was obviously Paine when it came to advocacy for the rights of man, but certainly Spence would have lumped her in with all the other bourgeois advocates for the rights of man. She was attentive to gender inequalities, but not very much, as you say, to class inequalities.
Well, the reference to Wollstonecraft means it's obvious that I'm going to turn to Laura to ask a question. Laura.
Oh, thank you so much. I maybe won't take a stand at Wollstonecraft rabbit hole just now. I think I'd want to defend her as a proper anti-property thinker to some extent, but anyway, that's probably for another time. And if that, thank you so much, Susan. That's fantastic. And I had some of my favourite crackpots in it, so that was really interesting and great to hear about Crowley as well. I didn't really know about. I haven't formulated a very clear question. I suppose what I'm interested in is what it did for you to take that really long view, to go that far back. I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, could you just say a bit about taking that kind of a panoramic view yourself?
Yes, I've never really done much historical research before. I'm just a lawyer. So I'm used to reading cases and doing other kinds of research, and I've done sort of, as I said, more theoretical research. But I just kept reading these people whose writing, sorry, I'm just going to have to drink a bit more water. My voice is drying up. I realized, well, I suppose I was aware of the diggers, and then went further back. How did in the book I also talk about More's Utopia. I got into, I sort of was interested in reading these people who were the voice of some kind of anti-enclosure sentiment in the 16th century, and that took me back to well, More and some other people at the beginning of the 16th century, but particularly the so-called Commonwealth men at Crowley, who was writing in the wake of Kett's Rebellion. I just found it incredibly inspiring to hear their voices. And unfortunately, I couldn't help myself from writing down their words. There are a lot of quotes in the book, because I thought at some level, these people have said everything that needs to be said about social justice. We just need to recover it. I mean, and often it's in a slightly unfamiliar idiom, obviously, but so powerful. So I just found it really, and even at some point, actually, I have some references back to the preacher from the 14th century peasants revolt, John Ball, anyway, so it was to do with just feeling myself inspired and wanting to situate this protagonist in the debate about human rights in a longer tradition as part of my effort to connect anti-enclosure sentiment and the effort to challenge the expropriation or the extinguishment of rights of common, to connect that with these ideas, alternative ideas about the rights of man. Does that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? To tie it back to that question of subsistence, I think it's really fascinating and works very well, doesn't it? To give it a kind of material basis in the ground rather than a very disconnected sense of what rights might have meant. Yeah, definitely. It does make me think, some of those questions about universalization are making me think about some of the like Cuguano and some of the anti-slavery texts as well, which are maybe not saying so much about subsistence, but are pushing for that idea about how if you mean this, you have to universalize it.
Yeah.
Interesting. But thank you.
I see Rod has appeared. So Rod.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a fascinating presentation and very much beyond anything I am familiar with. I was musing as you were talking about the little controversy this morning in this part of the world about the proportion of homes. We have big housing scarcity in British Columbia generally. The proportion of homes that are owned by people who don't live in them, and just thinking about the property rights question as it comes to home locally. But the question I wanted to ask was, have you connected this discussion at all to the concern with the personhood of the corporation and the extent to which sort of enclosures and property rights and our difficulty in addressing the problems that arise, the extent to which those are centered in our inability to do anything about the human rights of the corporation, or our tendency to ascribe to the corporation all of the rights of the humans without any of the moral or responsibilities or sense of norms or community obligations. That you talk about the offense against conscience that Spence talks about, but there is no conscience in the corporation to provide those guidelines. Any thoughts on that question?
That's a really interesting connection, which I don't make in this book and haven't really thought through, but I'd like to now that you raise it. I guess the history of the personhood of the corporation takes us in a different direction, but intersects in some interesting ways. I'd have to think that through further, but what an interesting idea, and certainly takes, and also points up how far ideas of human rights have moved away from this kind of counter vision that we find in work like that of Spence. Certainly.
Thanks.
Thank you.
John, you have been sitting patiently waiting to ask your question.
Yes, again, thank you, Susan, for a wonderful presentation. I'd be interested in knowing from the cast of characters you've talked about, and this relates to the question of how radical they were, whether there's a distinction between those who say, well, there was common land in which the poor shared, and they had rights in that common land, and that's what I want to see restored, and how far they would say, no, that's not good enough. All of the land has to be divided up and shared by members of the population, be they formerly rich or formerly poor. So I mean, how radical, in fact, was Spence? How radical was Crowley? Were they merely arguing that common land should be turned back, which may have seemed doable, and there were statutes to that effect? Or how were they going further and saying all land should be divided up?
Spence was going further. Crowley wasn't. As you know, I'm sure that the diggers were, the diggers' idea was not to forcibly expropriate anyone's land, but to attract others to join in a common enterprise. And the sort of fantasy was that, actually it was also part, it wasn't just a fantasy. So that their idea was through labor withdrawal, the rich landowners would be encouraged to come on board. Spence's idea was more radical. He thought that, he imagined some kind of meeting in which parishes took back land and arranged for co-ownership at parish level, so that all land, anyone occupying land would pay rents and so on to the citizenry generally. So that was a much more radical proposal. That wasn't just the restoration of rights of common, and that wasn't just objection to the extinguishment of those rights. That was what some have seen him as a precursor to projects of land nationalization, but of course it wasn't a national project. It was a project that he thought should be carried out at local level.
Thank you.
Susan, while others are contemplating their questions, I have one myself. The story that you tell in the book and the story that you told us today, it strikes me that it's a very English story. And by the time that Spence is writing, colonialism has been going on for quite some time. And I mean, not just colonialism in terms of settler colonialism across the globe, but in the implications for the Irish, the implications for the Scots. This has been going on for quite some time by the time that Spence is writing. And it's not so much a question about Spence as such, but to what extent is there a literature out there that you came across which drew connections from the English focus to a wider focus?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm choosing to tell here a local story, but there is a global story that's very much there. And those two things are inseparable. And there are people working on that, yes. Perhaps not so much directly on Spence, although he refers at times to things happening in the colonies at a variety of levels. So yes, there is a connection that we know. There is a very important connection that we know about, and we know also that there is very much today an interest in the global dimensions of this. I was just, as I said earlier, fascinated to tell this very particular local story of dispossession and enclosure and class formation, leaving aside those wider dimensions, and so that I could focus also on the protest movements and the language in which that protest was undertaken in England. But I certainly recognize that this happened in the context of broader imperial relations.
Indeed. I mean, no, I totally take your point. It just strikes me as sort of interesting and strangely ironic that many of the people who would have been receptive to the ideas that Spence is saying are feeling that one way out of the tyranny that they've suffered by having their lands taken away is to find opportunity elsewhere, where they then become part of the problem.
Exactly. Well, we know that the first step to becoming an oppressor is to experience yourself as a victim.
Indeed, indeed.
And so, yeah, of course, this was replicated in the colonies, and we know that the same notions of, well, not the same, but enclosure also happened.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
And rights of common and common lands. Obviously, the patterns were distinctive everywhere, different. But of course, the same history. The victims of enclosure went abroad and replicated the same processes of dispossession.
Thank you, Christopher.
Susan, thank you so much. I appreciate it. In keeping with Andrew's thread of colonial influence, but also coming out of John's questions about context. So you cast Spence in this conversation with Burke and Paine. And it's interesting that Paine is simultaneously writing his agrarian justice. So he's working on his own land scheme. And at the disadvantage of not having read your book, I'm wondering if you bring that conversation together and talk a little bit about the difference in the positioning of where they go.
I do, yes. I do. To be honest, I wrote this quite a long time ago. I'm just trying to recover in my mind. What I mean, I think that I'm not going to be able to answer that very specifically, but Spence's land plan was much more far-reaching than what Paine argues for in agrarian justice, written against the backdrop of famines in that period, as you know. Even at the end of Rights of Man, of course, there are proposals for various forms of welfare rights, and then in agrarian justice, he has some other ideas about redistribution, if I remember well. But Spence's proposal was much more far-reaching, and I didn't find anything in. I mean, I think it's interesting that Paine wrote that, and that it's not nearly as well known as Rights of Man, and we associate him with the arguments about popular sovereignty and not so much about that. So that in itself I find quite telling. But I seem to remember not finding anything in his writing that really sought to redefine his rights of man in these terms.
More of a distribution through the common rent, right? That
Rather
he's trying
than
to
something
achieve
that would
in that way.
On processes of production and the system.
But not necessarily trying to undo enclosure and the property rights that come.
That's right. No, that's right. He didn't call it into question, if I remember well. That's how, yeah.
Well, I have ordered the book while you've been talking, so I will be up to snuff next time around and be ready to go. Thank you for your time today.
As you know, I mean, these things, it came out in 2019. I finished writing in 2018. I'm now working on something. I mean, I shouldn't be saying that because, I'm giving a talk on it now, but but yeah, he didn't. I don't think he wanted to rock the boat in terms of the bourgeois class of people that he was addressing in Rights of Man, to any great degree. But he was aware of hardships in the light of famines of the period. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Are there other people out there with a question? I realize that we're sort of running close to our end time. Perhaps what I could do right now is to pick up Christopher's point. Christopher very wisely spent a small portion of the talk ordering a book, and I encouraged everybody. I cannot think of a book that deserves more to be on an academic's shelf than this. It really is. Having read this, this is a really wonderful, wonderful book. And very elegant, just like the...
The thing I would say is that on the cover, you will find an amazing picture by William Blake that I really loved. I talk a bit about Blake in the book, actually.
There it is.
See that? It's sort of ruined crops. And it's got a tree. I make a bit of the, in this book, I make a bit of the image of the tree. I sort of have some stuff about the tree, both metaphorically and literally, the tree of liberty, the false tree of liberty, which you can see I got from that text by Spence, and that's given the title to the book. But it's a all the best crackpots, says Laura. I guess that makes me one of them.
Well,
absolutely, we should all embrace that as an identity.
If there are no more questions, we might draw the formal meeting to a close. It was just wonderful that you could be here talking to us today and giving such a wonderful presentation about such a wonderful book. And so I'm sure everybody feels, as I do, how grateful we are. So thank you very much indeed, Susan.